Charles mentioned, I'm going to talk to you today a little bit about Street Feast and Modern Assembly, what I'm about to launch next year. We're going to touch on a little bit of art and music and see where food meets wider culture. But before we do that, I'm going to give you a little taste of what Street Feast is all about. Get into Street Feast, how I started it. I'm going to ask for a little show of hands on something. Hands up, anybody here who stood inside a DJ booth? I'm not the only person. 2, 3, okay, not many, about 10 people here. Okay, the reason why I asked that, because that's what I used to do for a living. Before I started Street Feast, I spent about 15 years putting on parties all over the world, from warehouse parties in East London like this, to pool parties in Miami, to beach parties in Ibiza. And I used to kind of enjoy this view. I was probably standing next to the photographer when he took this shot. And I'd always like looking out and seeing people kind of having the time of their lives, except on this particular occasion. This was New Year's Eve 2010, somewhere in East London. And I had at that point maybe a feeling that some of you have had. You know, when you've maybe sat at your desk, you looked out at the rest of the office and you thought to yourself, I really don't want to be here anymore, but I don't really know what else to do. So what I ended up doing, and what I'm doing now, I'm going to talk you through, and we're going to talk through how we went from that East London warehouse on New Year's Eve 2010 to an East London warehouse on New Year's Eve 2013, where that young man, Ben Spalding, a chef who had cooked at the Fat Duck in Bray, cooked at multi-Michelin-starred restaurants like Per Se in New York, was there serving a 10-course dinner to our guests in this room, in this East London warehouse, while in another room there are 10 of the best street food traders in London, serving 1,000 people, and for what was, in 2013, quite a unique kind of New Year's Eve event. Now, to tell that story, we kind of need to go back to the first warehouse. Now, that warehouse in 2010 had a car park at the back of it. And the idea of running a car park didn't particularly interest me. This wasn't the holy grail new career that I was looking for. So I thought, how about if we didn't make that a car park? How about if we made that private space a public space? If we filled it with art and music and food and drinks. Now, the art and the music and the drinks bit I could do, but I couldn't do the food bit. So I sent a friend of mine out into the streets of London. I said, please, it was about 2010. I said, go and find who's selling the best hot food in markets around London. And this person came back and said to me, there's this whole street food revolution thing going on. It's really interesting. So we did this event, we got these guys in, and to be completely honest, it wasn't the best event I'd ever done in my life. But I really enjoyed doing it. And the reason why is because there was a sense of camaraderie amongst these street food traders. Now, these people, to all intents and purposes, should be in competition with each other. But if somebody had forgotten their gas, or they'd run out of gas, somebody else would lend them some gas. Somebody else, their lights are broken, somebody else would lend them their lights. And that really struck a chord with me. So as I said, the event wasn't the best event we'd ever done, so my business partners didn't want to continue doing it, but I saw something in it. So I sold my business, And I walked away from an industry I'd been in for about 15 years. And for the next 12 months, I completely immersed myself in the kind of the alternative dining scene in London. So not just going to every new restaurant that was opening, but if there was a supper club under a damp arch somewhere in the back of Bethnal Green, you could probably find me there. And if there was a food market, you'd probably find me there. And pretty much on a Saturday, my little boy, who was probably about 3 or 4 at the time, would say to me, "What are we doing today, Daddy?" And I said, "We're going to a food market." He goes, "Not another food market, Daddy." And I was like, "Well, yeah, but one day we'll have probably one of the best food markets in London." So I kind of made a rod for my own back with that one. So I kind of had to see it through. So I immersed myself in the scene so much, I actually went undercover as a street food trader just to see what it was like. And this is me selling hot dogs on a stand with a guy called Abby from Big Apple Hot Dogs. And in my back pocket is actually a flyer for the first ever street feast. And I didn't tell any of the other street food traders who I worked alongside for those couple of months what I was going to do. I literally, as far as they were concerned, I was just another regular street food trader. But Abby knew, and he would talk to me about his plans for his big business, and it was an exciting time for those street food traders around 2011, 2012. They could sense that something was building, and that not many people in the industry and in the wider, in the mainstream, knew how big this thing was going to be, but they could all sense it, and it was very exciting for them, and I was glad to be able to see it from that side. And now, so I'd also then talked to Abby about this night market I wanted to start, and I hadn't quite got the name right. I was thinking of calling it Street Feast, but I thought that might have been a bit too obvious. But I was also really struggling to find anywhere to host this thing. No landlord would give me their property, and I was very insistent that this thing needed to happen every Friday night. Now, at that particular time, the only place you could get this kind of new gourmet street food was at lunch markets, like maybe at Whitecross Street Market. You couldn't get it in the evening. And having been to night markets in places like Zanzibar and Barbados, I knew this is something that we could do in London, and it would really take off. So, luckily, one Friday night, I was driving around with Abby, selling hot dogs somewhere. We drove past an empty little car park just off Brick Lane, and I tracked down the guy who owned it, and I struck a little deal with him, and I gave him 500 quid cash every Friday night, and he let me launch Street Feast. And on the opening night, this is Home Slice Pizzas. Now, what I particularly love about this picture is that pizza from Home Slice. Now, at the time, Home Slice was 3 Australian guys who had a homemade pizza oven with some wheels on it, which they strapped to the back of their car, and they would just drive around London selling pizzas at parties, at markets, and whoever really would want them. And hot dogs and pizzas were kind of popular party food, so we got to know these guys quite well. Now, they don't do that anymore, because they've got 5 restaurants across London, not just pop-up restaurants, but permanent restaurants in Fitzrovia, in the City, in White City, in Shoreditch, and in Neal's Yard. And that pizza looks pretty much that they sold back there, that's in 2012 when we launched Street Feast, looks pretty much the same as it does right now if you go into any of those restaurants. And that tomato sauce on that pizza is the best tomato sauce on any pizza in London, as far as I'm concerned. Now, we were quite lucky with Street Feast. This is probably the 3rd or 4th event we did. It was really busy from the very beginning. And as you can see, it's quite simple from the kind of video you saw earlier on, what Street Feast looks right now. This is how we started. But what I love, and particularly in this picture, this is kind of a tale of 2 tents for me. On the far right-hand side, you'll see this yellow gazebo here. Now, when you think about the rise of street food, you'll think about gourmet hot dogs and gourmet burgers, and that's an easy sell. Now, at that particular time, if you ask any of those people where Seychelles was on the map, they probably couldn't tell you where the Seychelles was, but they could all find that particular stall, and that food was from a family from the Seychelles. That stall was the busiest stall that night. And that taught me a lot about people. It taught me a lot about people's curiosity. And it also taught me that this thing would grow, because if we could continue to find new cuisines, if we could continue to find really interesting dishes for people, then they were up for it. It wasn't just a matter of people stuffing their faces with burgers and tacos, even though that happened a lot as well. So, as we moved on, as much as this was was a great success, this also really wasn't the vision of the all singing, all dancing street food market that I'd promised my son when I was dragging him to those food markets. I knew we needed to do more. And one of those things was to really invest in the production to make this a much better experience for people. So I said it was a tale of 2 tents. The other one I'm talking about is right at the back. There's a little black gazebo, and that was the bar. And we were just selling some beers and spirits and mixers. It wasn't particularly interesting. So I knew the bar needed to improve to give people a better offering, but also so sales would be better so we could invest in the infrastructure. So a year later, when I found an old timber market, an old timbers yard in Haggerston, and I convinced the guy to also let me rent it for £500 a night. I wasn't able to keep that going for too long, unfortunately. We improved the bar offering. And I got a guy called Jonathan Downey, who I'd known for many years and who at the time was kind of a well-respected bar operator, to come in and take over managing the bars from the team who were managing them for me before. And we were then able to have a bigger space. And what you can't really see at the top of this picture is where that white fence is at the top. That's the first floor where Ben Spalding, the guy from the warehouse, was again doing a wonderful little supper club in there. In the top left-hand corner, there's what was the old offices of what was that Travis Perkins Builders Merchants. We turned into a place called the Gin Store. And it's an amazing little gin bar that we created in there. And the bar was busier, or better cocktails, and we were able to bring a better experience. So by the time we moved on to Dalston Yard a few months later, we were really able to build out what was a much better and interesting experience for people rather than just one room of lots of gazebos. We were building in little areas, little tree houses for tequila, and improving not just the environment, but also the food offering. And this is Healthy Yummies. These guys were doing, even back then, were doing fresh sea dive scallops with celeriac puree and a lovely little bit of pancetta. So Street Feast was evolving quite nicely, and this was our first big summer, and I was really happy with it. But this outdoor event, you wouldn't be able to work in the winter, so we're trying to work out back in 2013 now, actually, how could we translate this for the winter? Now, what I didn't want to do was just to stick a whole load of gazebos and put them inside of a warehouse. That really wasn't going to work for people. We needed to elevate the offering again. Now, I'd been reading about all the hawker markets in Singapore, and I had an idea of fusing that Singapore hawker market with kind of a New York speakeasy style cocktail bar. So I came up with a concept called Hawker House, and we launched the first Hawker House in autumn winter 2013. And again, this is a place where we were able to move the food offering on. So these are these little roller sliders from a crew called Roller Walla. Now, up until this point, Roller Walla used to do these very big naan wraps. Now, if you're at a lunchtime market, having a big naan wrap is kind of a one-hit wonder that'll sort you out for lunch and you're okay. But walking around the night market, that's not really what you want to be eating. So they basically decided to shrink down the offering, and they would do 3 of these naan wraps for about 6 or 7 quid. And it was the first kind of example of this new eating environment, then kind of changing the dishes that were being served at that environment. And it was such a success that we decided to open for New Year's Eve that year again, and we invited Ben Spalding in, and Ben was getting people to lick bread and butter pudding foam off the back of their hands. And so this point here is interesting for 2 points. It shows how far we came in just 3 years from putting on my very last warehouse party in 2010 to getting to this point in 2013. And it wasn't just a mark of how far we'd come, but it was also laid the foundations for what we were going to go and do. Because up until this point, we never really had any dining experiences at Street Feast where we'd sit down with really great chefs. So every year when we opened up, we'd open up for the summer at Dalston Yard, we'd always look about how we could elevate the offering, as I've mentioned before. So we took the idea of people sitting down and dining, and we created the next summer a series of what we called micro-diners at Street Feast at Dalston Yard. And we got Pizza Pilgrims and also Bob's Lobster, and we created a space for them to do a little bit more with their menu and with their offering. So later that, which really took off. So later that year, when I was offered just further down the road from our Dalston site, this big yard in Shoreditch, I thought, well, I can't go and create another Street Feast because we've got one up the road with lots and lots of street food traders and just a few micro-diners. Why don't we make this all micro-diners, which is exactly what we did. And we turned this yard into this, and this became Dinerama. Now, this is now 2015, and I've spent a few years running Street Feast, and I felt as though I'd finally given my son the big all-singing, all-dancing food market that I'd promised him a couple of years back. But also, this was it for me with street food. I had seen in the very first summer of doing Street Feast, I'd noticed something. And I was there on a Saturday daytime, and I could pretty much split the crowd into 2 distinct camps. On one side, I'd have what I used to call the truffle mayo brigade. These are the arch foodies who are going around tasting absolutely everything and talking to every single street food trader and really interested in their journeys. And the other side, you just had regular Joes. So after 3 or 4 hours, I know why truffle mayo is still there, because truffle mayo hasn't tasted everything, hasn't talked to everybody. But regular Joe, you have 2 days off a week. It's Saturday. I can profile this person. I can see they're mildly cultural. Why aren't you at an art exhibition or something cultural? And that's because in East London, where Dalston is obviously, there isn't a permanent institute for culture. So unless there happened to be a pop-up kind of cultural event at that time, you might as well just spend your afternoon getting drunk and shoving your face with craft beers and tacos at street feast, because there isn't what else to do, because you really can't be bothered to go to the Barbican or into the ICA or go over to the V&A. And for somebody like me who's been going out in East London for now 20 years, I realise, that means a lot. Because I used to hang out in East London in the mid-90s when I first went up there, at a time where Alexander McQueen was living in Hoxton Square, Damien Hirst was exhibiting in the original White Cube, which was in Hoxton Square at the time, and Bjork and Goldie, who were dating at the time, used to hang out at Goldie's party, which was called Metalheads, also in Hoxton Square, at a place called the Blue Note, which was a seminal nightclub at the time. The Blue Note was on the site, which is now Bill's restaurant in Hoxton Square. Now, having been out in East London for so long and seeing how creativity and culture have played an important role in the kind of regeneration of the area, I've always thought that the area deserved a cultural institute of its own, somewhere that really represented that creative spirit. And that's something that's always kind of just sat there on the ideas shelf for me. And it's only when I did Street Feast that I realized that actually adding a defined food and drink offering to that experience could be really interesting. So I noticed that very early on in my Street Feast career, but I knew it wasn't the time to kind of stop Street Feast straight away. I really wanted to go on and innovate and do what I'd done with Hawker House and then with Dinorama. So in 2015, I sold Street Feast to a new company that was formed with my old business partner, Jonathan Downey, created a company called London Union. Henry Dimbleby from Leon set that up and took it forward. I'm still a serious shareholder in London Union, but I don't get involved in the day-to-day. So since then, what I've been doing is a number of things. I've been traveling the world, looking at if there are any institutes around the world that really fuse food and wider culture in a meaningful way, where the culture isn't just an add-on, or where the food isn't just an add-on, as it quite often is. And at the same time, I've also been looking at what's been going on in street food here, and it's been a really interesting observer, and it's interesting to be able to observe when you're not trading. And I've been going out a lot, and I've been seeing things like Box Park, and Box Park is an interesting story because Box Park launched in 2011, trumpeting themselves as the world's first shipping container retail mall. And it was great, and it was great in Shoreditch. But it was very interesting that after Street Feast arrived, all subsequent Box Parks, like this one in Croydon, became shipping container food halls with no retail. And all of them are going to just be food and drink from now on. And then more recently, some of you might know that there's a new concept in the scene called market halls, and I really like what market halls are doing. They've got some of London's best restaurants and kind of favourite restaurants involved, like a place called the Marksman. Now, the Marksman is well known for doing one of the best Sunday lunches in London. Now, a Sunday lunch isn't the sort of thing you want to be rolling around at a night market in, but they also do these amazing beef and barley buns, which is perfect for that environment. So really, market halls are looking at some of the best restaurants in London and homing in on the dishes that really suit that environment, which I think is a really smart thing to do. So as I think about opening my new site next year, what we're going to be doing is launching a place called Modern Assembly. It's a 30,000 square foot site in Hackney, which will have 20 kitchens, half of which will be vegan. There's a 200-seat lecture theatre, there's an art gallery, there's a 300-capacity live music venue, an innovative retail space. And when I think about the food that we're going to be putting on there, we start to think about what about the food that's already here, because we're in Hackney. There's a rich amount of food already here from the people who are living in this area. So what we're now doing is we're talking to the people who live locally, and we're talking to people from Eritrea and from Trinidad, and we're discovering dishes that we didn't even know about. And our chefs are working with these people so that when you come to Modern Assembly, you'll actually also be getting the food from the community that we're based in. And as well as looking at the food that we're going to be having there, I'm also looking at the design. Now, we're working with an interior designer called Aphrodite Crasser. This is one of Aphrodite's designs. This is from the Perfectionist Cafe, which is Heston Blumenthal's place in Heathrow Airport. Now, one of the things I love about Aphrodite's design is there's great movement in her design. She literally guides you around the space. And that's important for a place like Modern Assembly, because what I want is for you to be able to grab a taco, go listen to a lecture, grab a craft beer, then go and dance to a cool new band. And having someone with a really intelligent design that guides you around the space is incredibly important. And as well as having the space right, as mentioned earlier on, we're also going to be moving on our offering. Now, I've been looking at, I'm not vegan myself, though I have the odd week where we'll do it. Myself and my girlfriend will choose a week every couple of months, and that's all we'll eat. That's how we'll eat for that period of time. But what's been going on with vegan food is really interesting. 2 weeks ago, I went to an event called Vegan Nights. It was on a rainy Thursday night in the back of Bethnal, just off Brick Lane. There were 4,000 people there. And what's going on there really reminds me of the early days of what was going on with street food. Now, what was interesting, I was just talking to Liz Cherry, who's going to talk to you a lot more intelligently about vegan culture than I can do, because my feeling is really just from my gut. But I've done everything from my gut. And I would say, of those 4,000 people there, I'd say 60% of them were people, young people in their early 20s. And the majority of them were vegan because they think it's just cool to be vegan, rather than really passionately feeling it. And so we were looking at that. So when we start thinking about having a defined vegan offering at Modern Assembly next year, it isn't really about having vegan street food and vegan junk food and just frying up vegetables. It's actually working with really interesting chefs, whether they're well known or not. I mean, we are actually getting some chefs who are well known for cooking meat and getting them to cook plants and looking at the interesting ways that you can cook plants. If you look at this as a chard and carrot tortellini, and dishes like that it's not just going to be an elitist, but dishes like that are what get me excited about vegan food and plant-based food, and that's what we're going to be interested to kind of highlight at Modern Assembly. Because, as I said, what's going on with vegan food, it reminds me very much of the early days of Street Feast. And when I think of the early days of Street Feast, this is our very first summer in Dalston. And what made that work was tribe, was people coming together, I had a kind of a saying I used to have in my mind at the time, is I wanted to create a viable alternative to eating in a restaurant or in a pub. So if you can remember, before Street Feast and night markets, if 6 of you went out for your friend's birthday, you'd be in a restaurant, sometimes a little bit tight, and you're all looking at one menu. And it was so nice to be able to give people 12, 15 menus to be able to look from. So you could go and do that with friends collectively, but also each individual could really make an informed choice of their own. So next year, when we open Modern Assembly, being able to add a defined vegan offering to that, but also add some art and some music and add a wider cultural experience, I really think that hopefully this will be what I consider to be a very modern assembly. Thank you.